She knew exactly what she was doing to her daughter. That's what makes the story unbearable. In 1946, a woman in her mid-40s sat in a Parisian apartment watching her daughter struggle. The daughter was in her early 20s, newly married, trying to establish herself as an artist. The mother had resources, connections, influence, everything needed to support that dream. Instead, she offered criticism, distance, the kind of calculated emotional withholding that masquerades as sophistication. Years later, that daughter would attempt suicide multiple times. Eventually, she would succeed. The woman who destroyed her was named Peggy Guggenheim. But this story doesn't begin with Peggy. It begins earlier. It begins with a woman named Flout Seligman Guggenheim, who taught her daughter that love was something you withheld rather than offered. Flete learned this from someone before her, and Peggy would teach it to someone after her. This is a story about inheritance, not money, though there was plenty of that. Not art or influence, though those mattered too. This is about something else entirely, the inheritance of emotional desolation. The way trauma moves through families like a bloodline, invisible but unmistakable, passed from mother to daughter, each generation believing they're doing something different, while repeating the exact same destruction. Peggy Guggenheim spent her entire life running from her mother. She ran across oceans, into bohemian cafes, into the beds of 1,000 men, into art galleries and museums and palaces. She ran so far and so fast that she became a legend, a woman who revolutionized modern art, who discovered Jackson Pollock, who saved masterpieces from Nazi destruction, who lived with such audacious freedom that she seemed untouchable. But she brought one thing with her on every escape: the emotional architecture of her childhood. The cold mother, the distant father, the sense of never being quite enough. And when her own daughter was born, Peggy replicated it all with astonishing precision. The tragedy isn't that Peggy was cruel in any obvious way. She wasn't. She was sophisticated, detached. She maintained what looked like emotional distance for reasons that seemed cultured and refined. She was a woman of the world, above the messy sentimentality that other mothers indulged in. This is how she justified it to herself. Her grandson would later describe watching his grandmother systematically make his mother cry. He would use the phrase incapable of human relationships, without anger, the way you'd describe a medical condition, because that's what it was. A condition, something passed down, something inherited. The real horror of this story is that Peggy understood the pattern. In her memoirs, she admitted her failures as a mother. She wrote about her inadequacies, her inability to show affection, her recognition that she'd damaged her daughter. She was self-aware enough to see what she was doing, and she couldn't stop. That's where the tragedy lives, not in ignorance, but in the gap between knowing and being able to change. Peggy possessed the intelligence to recognize her patterns. She lacked the capacity to break them. She watched herself repeat her mother's cruelty toward her own child with the helplessness of someone watching a train crash in slow motion, unable to alter its course. Her daughter would die at 41, having taken her own life. Peggy would refuse to accept the truth of her suicide. She would accuse her son-in-law of being responsible. She would spend years pursuing legal action against him, using her wealth and connections as weapons. Anything, literally anything, rather than confront what her own emotional absence had done. This is not a story about a woman who collected art. This is a story about a woman who collected everything except the ability to love her own child. A woman who gave the world masterpieces while withholding basic human warmth from the person who needed it most. A woman who understood her own wounds deeply enough to describe them in print, yet continued to inflict identical wounds on the next generation. It's a story about how self-awareness, without the capacity for genuine change, becomes its own special form of cruelty. To understand how this happened, we need to go back further. We need to understand the woman who started it all. We need to understand Flat and what she passed down to Peggy. We need to trace the exact moment when one mother's emotional distance became another daughter's lifelong wound. We need to see where the cycle began. and why. Despite all of Peggy's resources and intelligence, she could never quite break it. Peggy Guggenheim was born on August 26, 1898, into one of America's wealthiest families. But wealth is not love, and proximity to power is not the same as belonging. Her father, Benjamin Guggenheim, was a man who maintained separate lives in separate cities, his wife in New York, his mistress in Paris, his children somewhere in between, raised by servants. Her mother, Flat Seligman, came from old money herself, the kind of wealth that came with expectations. She was supposed to manage a household, produce heirs, maintain respectability. Love wasn't part of the job description. Neither was warmth, or physical affection, or the kind of emotional availability that young children require. So Flatte became what her own upbringing had trained her to be, a woman who understood duty but not connection, who could organize a dinner party but not console a crying child, who believed that showing emotion was a form of weakness, that maintaining distance was a form of grace. In the rigid social hierarchy of New York's German Jewish elite, emotional restraint was a mark of breeding. Families like the Guggenheims and Seligmans didn't display feeling, they displayed control. Flett had been raised by a mother before her, who'd likely learned the same lesson. The chain extended backward into history, each generation passing down the same cold instruction. Do your duty, maintain appearances, keep your feelings locked away where they can't embarrass anyone. Love was something that happened to other people, people less refined, less educated, less bound by the requirements of maintaining position. When Benjamin's infidelities became impossible to ignore, when his absences stretched longer and his indiscretions more obvious, Flett's response was not to fall apart. It was to withdraw further, to focus on what she could control: propriety, appearance, the maintenance of the family's social position. Her daughters would marry well. Her household would run smoothly. The Guggenheim name would remain unstained. But what about her own devastation? What about the humiliation of knowing her husband kept a mistress in Paris? What about the loneliness of lying beside a man who'd chosen someone else? These feelings got locked away somewhere deep inside, preserved in amber, untouched and unprocessed. She didn't acknowledge them. She didn't speak about them. She didn't allow herself to feel them fully. This is how trauma becomes inheritance. It doesn't disappear when you ignore it. It calcifies. It becomes part of the emotional architecture of the home. Children absorb it through the walls themselves. They learn not from what's said, but from what's withheld. They understand their mother's pain through her silence about it. Peggy absorbed this lesson perfectly. She learned that mothers don't cry. Mothers don't ask for comfort. Mothers maintain distance as a form of strength. Mothers protect themselves by refusing to be vulnerable with their children. This was the only template for motherhood she possessed. Benjamin Guggenheim was the kind of man who lived for himself. He'd made a fortune in mining and smelting, building an empire that rivaled the Rockefellers and Vanderbilts. He traveled constantly, maintained business interests across continents, and treated his marriage as one obligation among many, perhaps not even the most important one. He had an apartment in Paris. Everyone knew about it. Everyone understood that it served purposes beyond business. The servants knew, the family knew, the society pages knew through their careful silence on the matter. There was a mistress there, a French singer named Leontine Aubard, and Benjamin divided his time between two women, two cities, two lives. For Flallet, this was the central humiliation of her marriage. She was the wife in New York, the respectable one, the one who managed the household and produced heirs and maintained social position. But she was clearly the secondary choice. The real affection, the real passion, the real priority lived in Paris with someone else. She had 3 daughters, Bonita, Peggy, and Barbara. All of them watched their mother try to maintain dignity while being systematically betrayed. All of them absorbed the lesson. This is what marriage is. This is what happens when you tie yourself to a man. He leaves you for someone else, and you must smile and pretend it doesn't matter. For Peggy specifically, her father's absence created a wound that shaped every relationship she would later pursue. Benjamin was frequently away, certainly, but more than that, he was away by choice. He chose his business. He chose his mistress. He chose Paris and adventure and freedom over the company of his own daughters. He didn't miss them. He didn't write them letters expressing regret at his absences. He simply lived his life and expected them to exist in the margins of it. This created a specific kind of wound in Peggy's psyche. Not the wound of grief exactly, though there was grief, but more fundamentally, the wound of not mattering enough. Her father's behavior communicated clearly that she wasn't important enough to compete with his other interests, that she was something to be maintained but not cherished, that love, if it existed at all, was something he dispensed to people and pursuits that mattered to him more than his own children. Peggy would spend her entire life trying to be important enough to make a man stay. On April 15th, 1912, the RMS Titanic struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic. Peggy was 13 years old. Her father was aboard the ship, returning from one of his European trips. He wasn't traveling alone. He'd brought his mistress, Leontine Aubard, along with their servants. He'd arranged first-class accommodations for himself and his valet Victor Giallo to share cabin B84. Everything about the arrangement communicated his priorities and his audacity. Traveling openly with his lover, arranging her comfort alongside his own. Moving through the world without pretending to care what his wife or daughters thought. When the ship struck the iceberg, late on the night of April 14th, Benjamin and Giallo initially slept through the collision. They were awakened by Leontine and her maid, who had felt the impact. The bedroom steward, Henry Etches, arrived at their cabin and helped Benjamin into a lifebelt, despite Benjamin's protests that it hurt. Etches made him put on a heavy sweater and sent him up to the boat deck. What happened next became the stuff of legend, a romantic myth that the newspapers seized upon and that the Guggenheim family would perpetuate for generations. As the situation grew more desperate and it became clear the ship would sink, Benjamin made a decision. He returned to his cabin with Giallo, and both men changed into their finest evening wear, white ties and tails. When Etches encountered them again and asked why they'd changed, Benjamin told him they were prepared to go down like gentlemen. He allegedly sent a message intended for his wife. "If anything should happen to me, tell my wife in New York that I've done my best in doing my duty." Survivors reported seeing Benjamin and Giallo seated in deck chairs on the grand staircase, sipping brandy and smoking cigars as the ship went down. Leontine, her maid, and Benjamin's valet Giallo secured places in lifeboats and survived. Benjamin perished when the Titanic sank, along with the vast majority of the ship's male passengers. The news reached New York on April 18th, confirmed by wireless dispatch from the Carpathia. For 13-year-old Peggy, her father's death was transformative, but not in the way most people might expect. Benjamin Guggenheim became a hero. The newspapers celebrated his courage, his dignity, his refusal to panic. He went down like a gentleman. He maintained his composure. He faced death with aristocratic grace. This narrative was comforting to everyone who heard it, especially comforting to Flat, who could now present her husband's story as one of nobility rather than infidelity. But Peggy understood something more complicated. She understood that her father had chosen to die in a certain way rather than live in a certain way. He'd chosen the dramatic gesture over the mundane survival. He'd chosen to go down elegantly rather than cling to life messily like the other men aboard. In some fundamental way, he'd chosen heroism over fatherhood. For Peggy, this became a template. Dramatic gestures matter more than actual presence. The story you leave behind matters more than the life you've actually lived. The romantic myth matters more than the boring reality of showing up for your children. Years later, Peggy would describe the Titanic disaster with what her biographers noted as strange detachment, as if it had happened to someone else's father. She inherited $2.5 million from Benjamin's estate, far less than her wealthier cousins received from their fathers. The money came in a trust fund that provided her with about $22,000 a year, enough to live comfortably but not extravagantly by Guggenheim standards. But the real inheritance wasn't money. It was something more insidious, the internalization of her father's death as a romantic narrative rather than a personal catastrophe. She learned that absence could be transformed into legend, that abandonment could be reframed as nobility, that you could leave people behind and have them celebrate you for it, as long as you did it with sufficient style. After Benjamin's death, something shifted in Flett. She didn't become warmer or more available. If anything, she became more rigid, more focused on maintaining appearances, more withdrawn into the world of propriety and social obligation. The humiliation was gone, certainly. She could now present herself as a tragic widow, rather than a betrayed wife. But she was also fully alone in a way she hadn't been before. The man she'd been tied to, the source of both her security and her suffering, was gone. She was left with the children he'd largely ignored, and the task of raising them to reflect well on the family name. Her response was to become even more controlling, even more focused on external markers of success and respectability. Peggy and her sisters would marry well. They would maintain their social position. They would not embarrass the family through scandal or inappropriate behavior. These became Flett's organizing principles. She didn't grieve openly. She didn't speak about Benjamin with warmth or nostalgia. She didn't share memories of him with her daughters in ways that might have helped them process their loss. She simply moved forward, maintaining the household, ensuring that life proceeded according to the rules. For Peggy, who was 13 at the time of her father's death and already feeling like an outsider in her own family, awkward, unconventional looking, difficult to place in the rigid social hierarchy, her mother's withdrawal became unbearable. The woman had never been warm, but now she was positively glacial. The distance between mother and daughter widened into something that felt like an abyss. Peggy didn't understand yet that her mother was suffering too, that Flett's coldness was a defense mechanism, a way of managing her own devastation and sense of abandonment by maintaining strict control over everything she could control. Peggy only understood that her mother seemed to resent her existence, that her emotional needs were a burden, that the safest strategy was to stop asking for anything and instead become fiercely independent. In 1920, at age 21, Peggy graduated from the Jacobi School in New York. She had access to her inheritance now, enough money to live independently. More importantly, she had an overwhelming urge to escape. She took a job at the Sunrise Turn bookstore in Manhattan, a gathering place for writers and artists who were exploring new forms of expression and deliberately rejecting the conventions of the previous generation. For the first time, Peggy encountered people who didn't care about social hierarchy, who mocked the very respectability her mother had spent her life protecting. She found it intoxicating. The following year, she sailed for Europe with her cousin Harold Loeb, a writer and publisher. Paris in the 1920s was the center of the avant-garde, full of American expatriates and European artists creating new forms of expression, rejecting tradition, embracing chaos and sensuality and artistic freedom. It was everything her mother's world wasn't. It was everything she needed to become someone other than the awkward daughter of a betrayed widow. Peggy threw herself into this world with the abandon of someone who'd been caged her entire life. She met Constantin Brancusi, Marcel Duchamp, Man Ray, and dozens of other artists and writers who would shape 20th century culture. She became friends with Juna Barnes, a novelist and poet who would remain one of her closest confidants for decades. She frequented cafes and salons, attended wild parties, and for the first time felt like she belonged somewhere. The bohemian world didn't care that she was awkward or unconventional looking. It celebrated those qualities. It made her feel less like an outsider and more like someone on the cutting edge of modernity. In 1922, she met Lawrence Vail, a writer and Dada sculptor known as the King of Bohemia. Lawrence embodied everything Peggy's mother would have hated. He was handsome, talented, charismatic, and utterly unreliable. He drank heavily, had violent mood swings, and treated social conventions with contempt. He lived for the moment, for artistic expression, for the pursuit of experience over stability. Peggy fell completely in love. But here's what's crucial to understand. She didn't fall in love with Lawrence despite his instability. She fell in love with him because of it. His unreliability, his emotional volatility, his refusal to be constrained by convention, all of these felt safe to her because they were familiar. They mirrored the emotional landscape of her childhood. A man who was present sometimes, but fundamentally absent. A man who lived for his own pursuits. A man who couldn't, or wouldn't, provide consistent emotional availability. This was what love felt like to Peggy. This was the only template she possessed. They married that year, and Peggy believed she'd finally escaped her bourgeois upbringing. They lived in Paris, then moved to the south of France, embracing a lifestyle of artistic freedom and deliberate provocation. Peggy wanted to shock. She wanted to prove she wasn't just another wealthy New York socialite. She cut her hair short, wore outrageous clothes, and adopted bohemian manners that would have horrified her mother. But something else was happening beneath the rebellion. The very things she was doing to escape her mother's world. The emphasis on appearance, the need to shock and provoke, the sense that life should be a dramatic performance, were actually continuations of the emotional patterns she'd inherited. She was still performing. She was still trying to be impressive enough, cool enough, provocative enough to be worth paying attention to. She was still seeking validation from people who couldn't provide it. In 1923, she gave birth to their son, Michael Cedric Sinbad Vale. 2 years later, their daughter, Peggy Jezebel Margaret Vale, was born. Peggy, the mother, named her daughter Peggy, a peculiar choice that some biographers have interpreted as narcissism, but which might more accurately be understood as a failure of imagination. She couldn't envision her daughter as a separate person. She could only see her as an extension of herself. And here's where the inheritance became visible. When Peggy looked at her newborn daughter, she didn't know how to love her. Motherhood didn't come naturally. She later admitted in her autobiography that she was inadequate as a mother, that she didn't know how to show affection, that she found the demands of children exhausting and boring. She described her relationship with her children as distant and formal, marked by the same emotional withholding she'd experienced from her own mother. She'd escaped her mother's world geographically. She'd rejected her mother's values intellectually. She'd created a life that looked nothing like her mother's life. But when it came to the fundamental emotional architecture, the way she related to her own child, she was her mother. Completely. Precisely. Identically. Meanwhile, the marriage to Lawrence was disintegrating. His drinking grew worse. His moods became more violent. He would fly into rages, sometimes physical, often directed at Peggy. She described incidents in her memoir where he publicly humiliated her, threw her belongings out of windows, and treated her with savage cruelty. He was living out his own patterns that likely traced back through his own family history, and Peggy was absorbing the blows with a resignation that suggested this was what she deserved, or at least what she expected. She didn't leave, not immediately. She seemed to believe that suffering was the price of living an authentic, artistic life. She endured Lawrence's behavior for years, convincing herself that this was what marriage to a true artist looked like. The violence, the drinking, the infidelity, these were just the costs of escaping her mother's world. She'd exchanged one form of emotional cruelty, her mother's cold distance, for another, Lawrence's active hostility, and somehow this felt like an improvement, because at least it was dramatic. At least it confirmed that her life meant something. In 1928, Lawrence began an affair with Kay Boyle, a writer Peggy had considered a friend. The betrayal was complete. But Peggy's response was oddly muted. She divorced Lawrence around 1928, and he eventually married Kay. Peggy was left with 2 young children and a growing sense that love was something other people experienced, not her. She was left with the understanding that the men she chose would inevitably disappoint her, would inevitably leave her for someone else, just as her father had left her mother. The pattern was establishing itself. The cycle was completing its first rotation. She was becoming her mother, emotionally distant with her children, unable to provide warmth, attracted to men who couldn't love her properly. And she was passing all of it down to her own daughter, the young Peggy, who was absorbing the message. This is what love is. This is what families are. This is what it means to be a mother and a daughter. Pegeen Guggenheim, Peggy's daughter, though they called her Pegeen to distinguish her from her mother, grew up in the shadow of a legend. Her mother was becoming famous. Her mother was discovering artists. Her mother was escaping convention and living a life of extraordinary freedom and creativity. What Pegeen experienced directly was something quite different. She experienced a mother who was frequently absent, traveling for her art projects, pursuing affairs, establishing herself in the art world. When Peggy was present, she was emotionally unavailable. She would exhibit Pegeen's artwork in galleries, but not as a way of celebrating her daughter's talent. Rather, she was adding her daughter's work to her collection, treating it as one more acquisition to display and control. Pegeen understood this distinction acutely. She understood that her mother was interested in her as an artist, not as a person, that her worth was measured by what she could produce, not by who she was, that her mother's love, such as it was conditional on achievement and performance. This creates a particular kind of wound. When a parent shows interest in your work, but not in you, when they celebrate your accomplishments, but don't comfort your sorrows, when they treat your existence as an extension of their own projects, rather than as a separate life deserving of care, this teaches a child something devastating about their own value. Pegeen internalized this message completely. I am only lovable if I am productive. My emotional needs are burdensome. My mother would prefer if I simply existed as a beautiful object to be displayed rather than as a person with actual human requirements. After her father's divorce, Pegeen was raised primarily by servants and governesses, just as her mother had been. The cycle wasn't being broken. It was being repeated. Peggy had sworn she would be different from her own mother. Yet here she was, raising her children with the same distant formality, the same prioritization of appearances over authentic connection. Pegeen became an artist herself, a genuinely talented one. She created paintings that were colorful and dreamlike, featuring domestic scenes and family groupings rendered in a naive, surrealist style. The figures in her paintings were doll-like, with empty, haunted eyes, despite their apparent happiness. Critics who understood her work recognized what she was expressing: the longing for family warmth, for maternal love, for domestic stability, all things that had been denied to her in reality. She was painting fantasies of what she needed. She was creating the family she'd never had. Every cheerful domestic scene was an act of desperate longing. In the 1930s and 1940s, as Peggy's fame as an art collector grew, Pegeen remained somewhat in the background, promoted by her mother's connections, exhibited in galleries, but never quite celebrated the way her mother celebrated other artists. There was always something slightly conditional about Peggy's support of her daughter's work, as if Pegeen's success was acceptable only insofar as it reflected well on Peggy herself. In 1946, Pegeen married John Holmesen, a French painter. It seemed, for a moment, like she might escape. She might find someone who could love her unconditionally, someone who could see her as a full person, deserving of care and attention, someone who could break the pattern. But Pegeen, like her mother, had inherited the template of what love looked like. She chose a man who was emotionally unavailable in his own ways. The marriage was troubled from the start. Pegeen gave birth to 3 sons, Sandro, David, and Caroli, but the relationship with Holmesen never solidified into something secure. More damaging was her mother's relationship to the marriage. Peggy despised John Holmesen. Whether or not her negative assessments of him were accurate, what mattered was that she used those assessments as a weapon. When Pegeen and her family visited the palazzo in Venice, where Peggy had relocated in 1948, Peggy would make cutting remarks about Holmesen's artwork. She would question his abilities in front of others. She would find ways to undermine him, to make him feel inadequate, to remind both Pegeen and Holmson that she held the power in the family. Peggy had money. Peggy had connections. Peggy had access to the art world. Holmson didn't. And Peggy used these power differentials to maintain control over her daughter, disguising her hostility as honest criticism or sophisticated detachment. Pegeen was already fragile. She'd struggled with depression throughout her adult life. She'd attempted to take her own life multiple times. Ralph, an art curator and deeply caring person, had intervened to save her. But the constant criticism from her mother, the never-ending sense that nothing she did was quite good enough, that her choices were always questionable, that her worth was always contingent, this was slowly eroding whatever psychological stability she'd managed to build. In the early 1950s, Pegeen and Holmson divorced. Pegeen remained in Europe, living between Paris and Venice, attempting to build a life independent of her mother's shadow. She continued painting. She created works that were exhibited internationally. For a brief moment, she seemed to be finding her own path. Then she met Ralph Rumney. In 1957, Pegeen attended a Francis Bacon exhibition at the Hanover Gallery in London. There she met Ralph Rumney, an English painter and one of the founders of the Situationist International, an art movement that rejected consumer capitalism and advocated for revolutionary social change. Ralph was everything Pegeen shouldn't have fallen for. He was unstable, prone to drinking and erratic behavior. He was financially dependent. He didn't have independent wealth or a reliable income. He was emotionally manipulative, capable of intensity and charm one moment, then coldness and cruelty the next. He was a man caught in his own patterns, struggling with his own demons, living hand to mouth on the margins of the art world. But he was also charming. He was artistically interesting. And most importantly, he paid attention to Pegeen in a way her mother never had. He seemed to see her as a complete person. He valued her opinions. He treated her as an equal rather than as an object to be displayed or controlled. For someone who'd grown up starved for unconditional attention, this felt like salvation. They married in 1958. Pegeen gave birth to their son, Sandro Rumney, the same year. For a brief time, Pegeen seemed happier. She lived first on the Île Saint-Louis in Paris, then moved back to Venice, setting up a studio in the basement of her mother's palazzo. She was painting prolifically. She had a son. She had a husband who loved her. It seemed, for a moment, like the cycle might be breaking. But Peggy despised Ralph. Her reasons, as stated to friends and family, were practical. He was a fortune hunter, using her daughter to access the Guggenheim money and connections. He was artistically inferior to Pegeen. He was emotionally unstable. He would ultimately destroy her daughter's life. There's a possibility that some of these observations contained kernels of truth. Ralph was unstable. He did depend on Peggy's money for survival. He would eventually face serious struggles. But there's another layer to Peggy's hostility that's more important. Ralph represented a threat to her control. As long as Pegeen was alone, as long as Pegeen was emotionally dependent on her mother for validation and approval, Peggy maintained a certain power. But Ralph gave Pegeen something Peggy had never been able to provide: unconditional presence. A man who showed up. A man who chose her. This made Peggy furious in ways she couldn't articulate. It made her feel replaced. It made her feel unnecessary. And her response was to use the only tools she possessed: wealth, social position, and the ability to make her daughter feel small and inadequate. When Pegeen and Ralph visited the palazzo, Peggy would make cutting remarks about Ralph's artwork. She would question his career choices in front of others. She would demonstrate, repeatedly and publicly, that she found him contemptible. More subtly, she would make remarks to Pegeen that communicated, "You could do better. You've settled for something beneath you. Your choice reflects poorly on you." Pegeen's grandson, Sandro Rumney Guggenheim, would later describe watching these interactions with brutal clarity. He recalled, "My grandmother had a knack for making my mother cry. He described watching his grandmother systematically undermine his mother's fragile mental health. He spoke about her as incapable of human relationships or giving affection. These aren't the words of someone angry at a distant grandmother. These are the words of a child who understood, even as a child, that he was witnessing emotional abuse, that the sophisticated detachment his grandmother maintained, the cutting remarks made with perfect diction and refined intonation, these were weapons. They were designed to hurt, and they were working. Pegeen was collapsing under the weight of trying to maintain her marriage, her sanity, and her mother's approval simultaneously. She was attempting to be a good wife to Ralph, while also meeting her mother's impossible standards. She was trying to be a good mother to her son, while managing her own depression. She was trying to be a successful artist, while doubting her own talent. She was trying to be a good daughter, while being systematically emotionally abused by the woman whose love she still desperately wanted. During the early 1960s, Pegeen created a series of glass sculptures, with artist Egidio Costantini achieving some recognition and critical success. In 1966, she held exhibitions in Canada, Stockholm, and Philadelphia. Her work was being recognized internationally. For someone who'd grown up in the shadow of her famous mother, this recognition should have been liberating. Instead, it seemed to deepen her despair. Her paintings had always been dreamlike and slightly unsettling, beautiful on the surface but haunted underneath. The doll-like figures in her domestic scenes had always possessed empty, haunted eyes, but in the 1960s her work became increasingly dark. The cheerful families became more grotesque. The domestic happiness became more nightmarish. The paintings documented the progression of her internal collapse. If you look at her work from this period, you're looking at visual documentation of mental illness. You're looking at a woman who understood herself deeply enough to render that self-understanding in paint, but who couldn't actually change her circumstances or escape her pain. Perhaps success made her realize that no amount of artistic achievement would ever earn her mother's genuine love. Perhaps she understood that the love her mother offered was conditional on performance, and that no amount of accomplishment would ever be enough. Perhaps she was simply exhausted from years of fighting depression, from trying to maintain a marriage to an unstable man, from trying to be the daughter her mother wanted, while also trying to be the woman her son needed. Perhaps the weight of being Peggy Guggenheim's daughter had simply become too much to carry. On March 1st, 1967, Pegeen was found dead in her Paris apartment. She'd taken an overdose of barbiturates. She was 41 years old. She left behind 4 sons, Sandro, David, Caroli from her marriage to Holmson, and Sandro from her marriage to Ralph. She left behind a body of work that was genuinely talented, genuinely moving, but that would be largely forgotten in the years to come. She left behind a legacy that was overshadowed by her mother's legacy. She left behind a question that her family would spend decades trying to answer. What pushed her over the edge? The official cause was ruled an overdose. Whether it was accidental or intentional wasn't immediately clear from the evidence. Pegeen had a history of depression and previous suicide attempts. She had access to barbiturates. She had been struggling with her marriage. She had been struggling with her sense of self-worth. There were no notes left behind explaining her decision. There were no clear triggers that would later emerge. There was simply the fact of her death and the vacuum of understanding that surrounded it. When Peggy received the telegram in Mexico informing her of her daughter's death, her reaction was complex and ultimately revealing. In her memoir, Confessions of an Art Addict, she wrote about Pegeen with what seemed like genuine grief. She described Pegeen as not only a daughter, but also a mother, friend, and sister to me. She called her death unexpected and mysterious. She wrote that no one in the world had I loved so much, and no loss could ever be so great. Peggy refused to accept that Pegeen had taken her own life. Despite Pegeen's history of depression, despite the overdose, despite everything, Peggy insisted it must have been an accident. Or worse, She increasingly suggested that Ralph had somehow been involved, that he had caused her death, either through active harm or through the emotional damage of their marriage. She accused Ralph Rumney, her daughter's husband, of being responsible for her death. She pursued legal action against him. She used her wealth and connections to make his life difficult. She spoke publicly about her suspicions. She built a narrative in which Ralph was the villain and she was the bereaved mother seeking justice. There were no grounds for prosecution. The evidence clearly indicated that Pegeen had taken her own life. But Peggy wouldn't let it go. She continued to blame Ralph publicly and privately for years. Why couldn't Peggy accept the truth? Because accepting that Pegeen had taken her own life would have meant confronting something Peggy couldn't bear, her own role in her daughter's suffering. It would have meant acknowledging decades of emotional neglect, constant criticism, and the systematic withholding of maternal love. It would have meant understanding that her coldness, her distance, her inability to provide unconditional affection, the very thing she'd inherited from her own mother, had contributed to her daughter's despair. It would have meant accepting that she was, in the deepest way, responsible. It's much easier to blame Ralph, much easier to be the wronged mother seeking justice than to be the mother whose coldness had helped push her daughter toward death. Much easier to construct a narrative of victimhood than to confront complicity. Ralph Rumney's life was destroyed by Peggy's accusations. He'd already been living a precarious existence, emotionally volatile, financially dependent on Peggy's money, struggling with his own demons. Peggy's public accusations transformed him from a struggling artist into a man accused of his wife's death. Friends who knew Ralph described him as alternating between penury and ridiculous abundance. Sometimes he lived in squalid rooms, other times he appeared at Venetian restaurants with money in his pockets. Money that friends understood came from Peggy. Money she gave to him to maintain her control, to ensure his continued dependence on her. His relationship with his son, Sandro, was severed. Peggy took custody of Sandro away from Ralph, wielding her wealth and social position like a weapon. Sandro grew up separated from his father, raised by his grandmother in the palazzo, developing his own complicated understanding of Peggy's nature. Ralph's reputation was damaged irreparably. He was known as the man accused of his wife's death. When he died in 2002, his Guardian obituary mentioned the accusations and his vindication, noting that he'd been unforgivably accused of his wife's death. The tragedy of his life, in many ways, was that he loved Pegeen, he couldn't save her, and then he spent decades being blamed for her death by a woman who refused to acknowledge her own complicity. In the years after Pegeen's death, Peggy continued living in Venice. She continued exhibiting her collection, supporting young Italian artists, and maintaining her position as one of the most important collectors of modern art. But she never truly processed Pegeen's death. She never allowed herself to grieve fully. She never said, "I failed my daughter. My coldness contributed to her pain. I could have done better." Instead, she kept some of Pegeen's paintings in the Palazzo collection. But she didn't promote her daughter's work the way she'd promoted Jackson Pollock or other artists. Pegeen's artistic legacy was left to languish, known only to specialists and occasional museum visitors who happened upon her paintings and wondered who she was. Peggy donated her palazzo to the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation in 1970, followed by her collection in 1976, with the stipulation that everything remain in Venice. She wanted her legacy preserved. She wanted to ensure that her contribution to modern art would be remembered long after she was gone. But she did nothing to ensure that her daughter's legacy would be similarly preserved. The irony is stark. Peggy had spent her entire life collecting masterpieces. She'd saved art from Nazi destruction. She'd discovered and promoted some of the greatest artists of the 20th century. But the one artist whose work deserved preservation and celebration was her own daughter, and that work was allowed to fade into obscurity. Peggy wore her famous butterfly-shaped sunglasses, designed by Edward Melcarth. She rode in her private gondola with her beloved dogs. She entertained visitors from around the world. She became a Venetian legend. But she was performing. She was maintaining a facade. Behind the butterfly sunglasses, behind the palazzo, behind the carefully curated image of the great art patron, was a woman carrying a weight she would never fully acknowledge. Peggy Guggenheim died on December 23, 1979, near Venice, after suffering a stroke. She was 81 years old. Her ashes were buried in the garden of her palazzo next to her beloved dogs. The placement is symbolically devastating. She chose to be buried next to her dogs, rather than next to her family. She chose to rest in eternal proximity to the animals she could love without condition, rather than the people who'd needed her love and hadn't received it. The Peggy Guggenheim collection opened to the public as a museum in 1980. Hundreds of thousands of visitors have walked through those rooms, examining masterpieces by Picasso, Pollock, Kandinsky, Ernst, and dozens of other artists, whose work Peggy preserved and promoted. The museum acknowledges Peggy's complicated personality. Wall texts describe her as a bold, eccentric collector who fearlessly advanced modern art. They mention her affairs, her extravagant lifestyle, and her role in discovering abstract expressionism. They celebrate her as a woman who defied convention in an era when wealthy women were expected to be decorative rather than influential. But the full story remains largely absent from the official narrative. The cost of her self-obsession, the daughter who grew up feeling unloved, the family tragedy, the generational transmission of emotional damage.